National Neuropsychological Society earlier this year, and I come from a research background, so it was really incredible to be able to see someone who finally has large-scale data on this topic able to share with you all. So Dr. Scott actually is originally from Memphis, Tennessee, and he went to undergrad at Wesleyan University. Did I do that right? I always get that one and Wellesley confused, but this was Wesleyan in Connecticut. And then he was actually in San Francisco for a while doing substance abuse research and cognitive functioning at UCSF. From there, he went and got his PhD in psychology at the Joint Doctoral Program at UC San Diego, and worked with some very well-known neuropsychologists down in Southern California. He did his internship at the Veterans Administration in Connecticut, and then did his postdoctoral studies at Yale in neuropsychology and neuroimaging. He, for the last 4 years, have been at the University of Pennsylvania as an assistant professor with the Department of Psychiatry there, and also continuing work, I think, with the Pennsylvania Veterans Administration. So his expertise and what you're going to hear a lot about today is a very phenomenal large-scale study in Pennsylvania on substance abuse, and he'll give you a good overview of a lot of the research going on in cognitive functioning, substance abuse, and mental health issues. So please welcome Dr. J. Cobb Scott.
Thank you very much. I am excited to be here to talk to you. I'm excited to be back in California. It has been a while. I actually got engaged in Santa Barbara, so it's a nice homecoming. Fortunately, I could not bring my wife because we were overlapping in scientific travel, which is a really, really geeky thing to do. So anyways, I'm going to talk to you today about cannabis, cognitive functioning, and mental health. I'm also going to do the slides along with the moving the slides on my computer together. So again, just yell at me if there's anything. Yeah, I guess I'm tall. So yell at me if I don't advance a slide for some reason. All right, so a disclaimer, the views expressed here are my own. They do not necessarily reflect the policy or position of the University of Pennsylvania or the Department of Veterans Affairs. So to give you an outline of what I'm going to cover, let's first start off just by looking at some of the changes in cannabis use that have occurred in recent years. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the brain systems involved in cannabis use, just to kind of give you a framework from which we can kind of work together to understand these effects. Look at cannabis associations with mental health outcomes, with cognitive functioning, and with structural brain measures, so actual brain measurement of brain structures from MRI scans. And in all of this research, I'm really going to be focusing on larger scale studies, some of which we've done over the last few years, and then also something called meta-analysis, which is it's kind of research on research. So it's a study of studies, and it's a systematic way of synthesizing research results, giving kind of quantitative estimates of the strength of associations. And then so you go through a literature and you basically combine a whole literature into your own database, and then you can look at the strength of association, and you can look at important things that might modify the strength of that association. And I'll explain that a little bit more as we get into those. Also talk a little bit about some of the emerging research and future directions, and then some concluding remarks. So what is my overarching aim here? It's to provide an evidence-based overview of some of the rigorous research that's out there examining links between cannabis, cognitive functioning, and mental health. And there's two main questions here. Oh, I didn't advance it. There we go. So, does cannabis cause cognitive impairment or increase risk for mental health problems? Tough question. And are these concerns heightened for the developing brain, and specifically for adolescents? And in some ways, but not with the simplicity or in the ways most commonly discussed. And hopefully by the end, you'll understand kind of why I came to that conclusion. So if you read Dr. Wolk's report, 200 pages, and you still can't sleep, this is another 400 pages released by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine this year. And it's actually, I wasn't involved in the creation of this report. I have some close colleagues who were. It's actually a pretty fantastic assessment of the current state of knowledge on cannabis, the potential health risks of cannabis, and the potential therapeutics that cannabis offers, and it really provides a nice kind of summary of the levels of evidence that are out there right now. And I'm going to use some of their language throughout this presentation. You'll see kind of some similarities to Dr. Wolk's language as well. So if you want to review this, this is now available. If you go to the website, it tries to ask you to buy it, but there's actually a free PDF download as well, so just so you know that. So I'm just going to take a second to talk about causality, because this is one of those things that oftentimes there's the public perception, the popular media takes a scientific study that says, hey, we found an association between this and this. We found an association between eating more olive oil and lower risk of cardiovascular disease. And it often is put within a causal framework. That's something that we do as humans, and scientists are also prone to this bias as well. We want to put things in a causal framework because ultimately that's what we're interested in. We're interested in looking at whether something causes change in something else, right? So there's a drug intervention and you want to see whether it works. But most of the cannabis research that's out there is observational, meaning that we're not randomizing people to get cannabis, one group to get cannabis and one group to not get cannabis. So it's really following people sometimes at one point in time in like a cross-sectional study, and then sometimes we follow people over time in longitudinal studies. But even if it's longitudinal, it's still observational. So there's still a lot of things that have to happen to say that, yes, this causes this. So the first one, and this is one that seems very simple, but a cause should precede an effect in time. So if someone who uses cannabis has cognitive deficits to start with, and then you show that they have cognitive deficits related to cannabis, you can't necessarily say that cannabis causes those cognitive deficits. The cause should be consistently associated with an effect. So it should be reproducible. So if I do a study in Philadelphia and I grab a sample of cannabis users and I give them some measures, or I scan their brains, and then we do a study here in Santa Barbara, the results should be reproducible. They should be broadly similar. There should be a biological plausibility of cause and effect, meaning that there should be some mechanism that actually makes sense here. And then the last one, and this is really important, you'll hear me talk about this as we go through this research, other potential causes, or what we call confounds, should be ruled out. So this is really difficult in cannabis research and in drug abuse research in general, because as you'll see with some of the research we've done, cannabis users also use a lot of other substances, heavy cannabis users, I should say. They also have higher rates of mental health problems and so on. And again, you might be jumping to, well, yeah, maybe they have higher rates of mental health problems because of cannabis use. Well, we can't necessarily say that. Sometimes bad things beget bad things, and they kind of cluster together. So this kind of just provides you a framework of the complexity of some of these studies and some of the ways that we try and look at the data. And we want to get to the causal interpretation of things, but we really have to be careful and think about the methods we use and how we get there. Some of the background, people probably can't see this very well, but in this top slide, in this top figure here, you see an increase in cannabis use. This is a survey that happens pretty much every year looking at 12th graders in the US, and you see kind of this increased use that happened in the late 70s, and then a decrease throughout the 90s, and then a relatively decent increase in the last 15 years or so. This seems to be leveling off now. The data from the last 2 years that has come out now shows some leveling off of this increased use. But what you see, this other line here, this is the perceptions of cannabis risk, and they mirror each other nicely. Again, we don't know that they cause each other, but they do mirror each other nicely in this figure. So there's been declines in the perception of risk with cannabis over the past 15 years or so. Down here, what you see is daily users in red here, and you see that has steadily increased in a slight way from the early 90s. It seems to have also leveled off. Right now, about 8 million people over the age of 12 use daily or almost daily use of cannabis. So we have a fairly substantial number of people who are using cannabis. And when do they start using cannabis? They start using it, for the most part, during adolescence, right? So I forgot to go forward. Okay. So here is age starting from, actually I can't read it on mine, from age 9 going up to like the late 30s, I think. And you basically see that around teenage years, this is cannabis, this bottom line here, people start to try it, and then use levels off. This is the percentage of people who actually use, levels off about age 21, steadily goes down until the late 30s. But most people are trying cannabis in their teens, and this is something Dr. Wolk talked about. There is this increasing potency of cannabis over the past 15 years or so, 15 to 20 years. And this is mainly from seed samples of cannabis that have been measured. So we have an increasing potency of cannabis. We have kids using it in their teens. And we have some discoveries that have happened over the last 20 years or so, which have shown that the brain continues to develop through one's 20s. So basically to the mid-20s, there seems to be a protracted period of brain development. So these are some large-scale studies of healthy teens and young adults showing decreases in gray matter volume. That's actually the neurons in the brain. That's actually, it seems like it'd be a bad thing because they increase up to that point, but it seems to be a process that occurs because white matter increases. So white matter is the kind of the highways of the brain, so it connects different areas of the brain. And then what you can see over here is this is kind of a figure that's it's a brain, and what you can see is as we go on towards kind of age 20, you see a decrease in gray matter, and it seems to have a spatial characteristic, meaning that the prefrontal cortex, a part of your brain right behind your forehead, seems to change kind of the latest and have the most protracted period of development. And that's an area involved in higher level thinking, reasoning, your ability to kind of keep things in short-term memory and manipulate them, and judgment. So all of these together kind of result in this idea of increasing concerns about whether use of cannabis, especially kind of with the increased potency of cannabis, may disrupt the normal trajectories of brain, cognitive, and emotional development. So I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to orient you to the endocannabinoid system. So one of the things that was discovered in the late 80s, early 90s one of the things that was well characterized was the endogenous cannabinoid system. Endogenous meaning coming from inside the body. This is a system that's in our body and our brain. And they were able to replicate these two cannabinoid receptors, CB1 and CB2, to show the existence of this system. And so we have endocannabinoids that are actually constantly operating in our body and our brains. They're naturally occurring. They activate cannabinoid receptors. And CB1 receptors in the brain actually have a really wide role in regulating other neurotransmitters and they maintain kind of this excitatory and inhibitory balance. So exciting when we need activity and inhibiting neuronal activity when we don't need it. And it's also been discovered that this system is involved in very important brain development processes from the postnatal period all the way through adolescence. So it's involved in synaptic pruning, so getting rid of the connections that are not as useful. It's involved in white matter development, so again, the development of the white matter, kind of the highways in the brain, and it's involved in the growth of new neurons. So it's very involved in a lot of important developmental processes. And cannabis has about 85, at least, cannabinoids in it that they've identified. So these are separate from the endocannabinoids, the ones that are already in your body, but they mimic them. And so delta-9 THC is the main psychoactive ingredient in cannabis. There are other ones that are still being discovered and investigated, but it seems that this mimics the endocannabinoids, primarily binds to CB1 receptors. And the interesting thing is THC is much more, the effects of THC are much more prolonged than endocannabinoids. Endocannabinoids apparently have quite a high kind of turnover. They could get absorbed relatively quickly. And so with acute intoxication, it's thought that THC disrupts this kind of balance, this regulatory system in the brain. So now we have a framework for, again, kind of getting back to this idea of biological plausibility. Is there a plausible mechanism here? And I think we have some evidence that there could be plausible mechanisms here. So moving on to cannabis use and mental health. So why are we concerned about this? So the first thing is co-occurring disorders, so having a substance use disorder and having a mental health disorder, that's quite common. So about 3.4% of the country tends to have a co-occurring disorder. Around, I think, 8 or 9 million people. And so what is some of the evidence for the relationship between cannabis use and other disorders? So the first thing is there's substantial evidence that cannabis use, that high levels of cannabis use and early cannabis use increases the risk for cannabis use problems. This is not a groundbreaking observation. Same thing with alcohol, same thing with nicotine, same thing with almost any drug. If you use more of it, you're more likely to have problems with it. If you use it earlier, you're more likely to have problems with it. But it's important to think about, because this is something that's often missed in the debate about cannabis use, is that you might have, if there is increased use, and we're not sure whether there's going to be increased use or not with legalization, but if there is increased use, you are more likely to potentially have some cannabis use disorder problems. But there's a lot of other factors that you can see down there that also contribute to increased use. So if you're male, for some reason we have weird things where we like to use substances a lot. If you smoke cigarettes, if you use a lot of other substances, and if you have other mental health problems, you're also more likely to develop a cannabis use disorder. What about for other substance use disorders? So there's moderate evidence, so not as much and not as strong, that more frequent cannabis use is associated with an increased risk for other substance use disorders as well. But what does that look like? So this is recent data that was published in 2016 from a nationally representative sample of almost 35,000 individuals. And so basically they have pretty comprehensive psychiatric interviews and substance use interviews. And this is now, I think, their third time point, and this is individuals who were interviewed, adults who were interviewed about 3 years apart. And so what you can see over here, so this is the association between cannabis use and any disorder, and cannabis use is really broken down into no cannabis use, some cannabis use in the last 12 months, but less than once a month, and greater than one cannabis use per month over the last 12 months. You can see that once, about 30% of people will just have some other kind of mental health disorder, even without cannabis use, but the numbers jump up quite a bit with a little bit of cannabis use. This doesn't seem to be the case, I'll talk about that in a second, for mood disorders like depression or anxiety disorders. There doesn't seem to be any sort of increased risk there. These are not significant. They look like they are, but they're not statistically significant. But there does for substance use disorder. However, this is mostly driven by an increase in cannabis use disorder. So there's about anywhere between a 7- and 9-fold increase if you use cannabis, that you're going to have a cannabis use disorder, but for the other ones, for alcohol and other substance use, it's about 2- to 3-fold increase. So much smaller for other substance use disorders. And unfortunately, like a lot of things with science, we wish we could give a simple answer, but it's really complex. So some studies that have looked kind of longitudinally, so looked over time at genetic versus familial factors, showed that early patterns of use, so how you use when you're a teenager, is really influenced by by your social environment, by your family, by environmental factors. As you get older, it tends to be more influenced by your genetics or other kind of familial things. So unfortunately, it's not that straightforward, and you're not going to be able to see this very well, unfortunately, but when they have done studies where they've looked at identical twins, and one twin used cannabis by age 17, and the other twin did not use cannabis by age 17, those effects, the increased substance use risk decreases pretty substantially, showing that there is a pretty strong genetic component even to that. And this is in something like 311 twin pairs. There's some incredible twin research that's out there where they look at fraternal and identical twins and all these sorts of things. All right, so that question is fairly complex. As Dr. Wolk mentioned, there is substantial evidence of a statistical association. Again, there's that statistical association, don't put it in a causal framework yet, between cannabis use and the development of schizophrenia or other psychosis. So the highest risk is among the most frequent users and those who use during adolescence. The risk seems to be heightened. There's some great studies out of South London looking at high THC cannabis. There are people there who use something called skunk, and they seem to have a heightened risk of psychosis in that group compared to other use of cannabis. There's also some indications when they look at people who have developed schizophrenia or another psychosis, and they ask them about cannabis use, and the people who have used cannabis tend to have an earlier onset of psychosis. So that's interesting, but it also raises the question of, okay, so there's plenty of people with schizophrenia and psychosis who don't use cannabis, so the question becomes, are there diverging paths to how you get to schizophrenia? Cannabis is neither necessary nor sufficient to have a diagnosis of schizophrenia or a psychosis, and so there might be multiple pathways, and again, it gets really complex. All right, so let's look at the size of the effect. Let's look at the magnitude of the association between the two. So these are two different meta-analyses that came out about 10 years apart. Both of them focused on the heaviest of cannabis users looking at increased risk. And you're going to see this type of figure a few times today, so I'll try and orient you to it. This is called a forest plot, and it's from a meta-analysis, again, a study of other studies. And so here you have different studies on the y-axis, different studies here on the y-axis, and then you have all of these things, which are kind of an estimate of the magnitude of effect. Down here you have an overall effect represented by this diamond in all the studies. And this is a line here and here of basically no effect. So the closer that the overall effect gets to that, the closer that or the more you think there might not be much of an effect or might not be that strong of an effect. So basically, heavy use of cannabis in this meta-analysis was shown to increase the risk of psychosis by about twofold. So there's something there, but it's kind of weaker than people had initially thought. A follow-up study in this, where they looked really at in each study what was the highest, what is the group that used the most in that study. So if it said this daily users versus non-users, they would use a daily user. If it said, we have people who use once a week, we have people who use 5 times a day, it would take the 5 times a day out of that. And so that showed a slightly higher risk, so about a 4-fold increase in psychosis risk. However, people are still trying to work this out, and it's an incredibly complex field. So schizophrenia is something that has developments or has an origin in early development, meaning that you can actually see signs of psychosis much earlier than when people use cannabis. So it's not thought that cannabis causes schizophrenia or psychosis in the absence of other things that are occurring. So cannabis is just one of a constellation of risk factors, and as I've said, in a lot of individuals who develop psychosis or schizophrenia, there's no sorts of, they don't use cannabis, so that's not part of their risk factor profile. The other thing is there's potential shared risk, so meaning that oftentimes cannabis is used with other substances. It's used with tobacco. It's used with alcohol, and it's used with other drugs as well. And so what we showed in a paper that was published this year in this kind of relatively large sample that I'll talk about a little bit more from Philadelphia, this is 8 to 21-year-olds, and we had almost no one in the sample who had a frank episode of psychosis, meaning kind of a detachment from reality where they had delusions or frank hallucinations or anything like that. These are what we call psychosis spectrum symptoms, so they're kind of strange beliefs, odd beliefs. They might have some kind of mild illusions or some mild hallucinations, but it's not enough to kind of necessitate a higher level of care for the most part. But we showed that that we could show some effects of cannabis even. You can kind of look here. These are our adjusted models, so we're trying to control for all those confounders in this model here. And you see that there's almost a 2-fold increased risk of cannabis, but it's really when it's along with other substances. When it's by itself, it's not statistically significant. So this, again, is just symptoms. It's not necessarily disorder yet, but it still goes to show you that it's a complex thing. And so here, you don't have to really, I'm not going to take you through this, but this was a paper published in 2014, and there are so many different competing models of how this actually works. So this idea of that there are similar genetic risks for both cannabis use and for psychosis. There's one going through the other. There's one affecting the relationship. So it's still really complex. But what can we say? We can say that if you do have some of this, some of the genetic risk, if you have a family member who has had a psychotic episode, or especially one who has schizophrenia, probably don't want to put yourself at increased risk by using cannabis. That's a pretty clear thing. Even though we can't make definitive statements, that's pretty clear that you don't want to potentially increase your risk. I mentioned this before, but there's limited evidence of an association between cannabis use and the risk of depression or anxiety disorders. So you've seen this figure on the right, which I showed before. This, again, is another forest plot, and we see that this is quite close to this line, not much of an increased risk overall across all studies. So to wrap up kind of mental health before I move on, again, I'm giving a broad overview. If anyone's interested in more details, dig into that National Academy of Sciences report. Early and increased cannabis use seems to be associated with increased risk of cannabis use problems. Again, it's kind of something that is obvious. And early and heavy cannabis use associated with an increased risk for psychosis symptoms and schizophrenia. Direct causal contribution is still unclear. It's still being worked out. There's a lot that we don't know, but it may vary by genetic risk. That seems to be something that's fairly clear. Okay, going to move on now to cannabis and cognitive functioning. By cognitive functioning, I mean kind of a broad set of cognitive skills that are necessary for being successful in everyday life. Memory, attention, executive functioning, or that higher order thinking, how fast you process information. Some people, it's kind of, IQ is involved in cognitive functioning, but it's also can be somewhat separated from it. And I'm just going to talk for one slide about prenatal cannabis use. So again, these are hard studies to conduct. It's hard to get a sample of individuals a sample of mothers who use cannabis and who are willing to come in and do research. But the longitudinal studies that have been done, some show slight evidence of, show evidence of slightly lower cognitive functioning. The results have been somewhat inconsistent. A lot of times it's based on the size of the sample. So again, trying to get enough people, trying to get enough individuals to participate and enough people who actually use cannabis while they're pregnant is challenging. However, the findings have been inconsistent. It's really hard to control for other potential causes and other potential confounds. Again, if you use cannabis, you're more likely to use other things while pregnant as well. But there's plenty of other risks to say we probably should not recommend using it for pregnant women. So low birth weight, complications after birth, all of those have been pretty well proven at this point to recommend abstinence. So it's not a tough one, even outside of thinking about cognitive functioning for their offspring. Okay, now moving on into cognitive functioning of adolescents and adults. So there's pretty broad consensus at this point that acute intoxication with cannabis causes cognitive problems. So it causes deficits in memory, attention, speed of processing, and some aspects of executive functioning. So while you're intoxicated, you don't perform as well on these tests. That's pretty well known. The question is about residual effects. So after intoxication ends, what happens? And those effects are somewhat less clear. And there's been a lot of research on this in the past 25 years, some of which we've been conducting. So this one's even harder to read, so I apologize for that. This was a meta-analysis published in 2012, and I'll really just orient you to a few things so that you can kind of go along with me here. So these are some different cognitive domains that we like to separate tests out into. A lot of these are related, and they overlap somewhat, but at the same time, we think that they are, kind of unique enough to warrant separating them out. So we have ones that are kind of executive functioning, attention, initial learning of information, whether you forget information over time after a short or longer delay. And what you see here, get this to go, is, it's fading on me, in the orange box here, you see for each one you have kind of a top star and then you have a bottom star. And so what those are, the top star is all the studies that have been conducted on this, and they have fairly short abstinence periods, meaning they could have an abstinence period of a day or they could have an abstinence period of 6 months, meaning that someone was not using the substance during that. And at the bottom, these are studies where they required abstinence of at least 3 weeks. This is all in adults. This is mostly people kind of average age of in their 40s, chronic using adults. And what do you see? So at the top, you see some small effects in certain cognitive skills when you look at all the studies. So this idea of executive functioning and really largest in learning and memory. Again, not large, quite small effects overall, but they're there. They're statistically detectable. But when you look at the smaller population of studies where individuals were abstinent for at least 3 weeks, you basically see no effect at all. So when these studies have come out, they've been fairly shocking for people in thinking about adults. But then there was a lot of research that started to occur around adolescent use. And there's been some prominent studies that have shown, studies that have been covered a lot in the media, that have linked frequent cannabis use in adolescents and young adults with cognitive deficits in, again, kind of these areas of attention, executive functioning, memory, and processing speed. Some studies in adults show associations between earlier use of cannabis, so cannabis usually before age 16, and especially heavy early use of cannabis, and cognitive deficits. But up to recently, most of these samples have been really small. They've been selective. They've been drawn from places like treatment facilities or college students. And some of the studies that have looked at abstinence show that those effects also diminish with a period of abstinence of a few days or more. So when I arrived at Penn, I had an incredible opportunity to get involved with this project called the Philadelphia Neurodevelopmental Cohort. So this was something that was funded by NIH, I think back in 2008 or 2009, and it's headed by Raquel Gore and Hakon Hekkenarsen. And this was a community-based study of 9,500 kids between the ages of 8 and 21. So a pretty substantial effort that's never been conducted before in this country, because it's representative of the city of Philadelphia because all of the people were drawn from CHOP area clinics. And so Hakon Hekkenarsen is a geneticist at CHOP at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And he, years ago, started giving a consent form to anyone who would come in for a pediatric visit for any reason. So primary care, specialty care, mental health care, and saying, hey, can I take a sample of your blood, and can I do genomic analyses on it? And critically, can I contact you in the future if we want to do additional research? And so because of this, they got this grant to study around 10,000 kids and try and provide a national resource of investigation between the relationships between genes, behavior, and the brain. And about 1,500 of these kids had brain imaging as well. So a substantial effort. It happened in about 3 years. And I'll show you a slide in a second that just shows how much of an insane effort it was. And I will say I arrived right at the end of when all these data were being collected. And everyone was kind of exhaling from the amount of effort they had put in to get all this data. So I didn't point out actually what this is. So this is the city of Philadelphia. These yellow triangles are a CHOP area site. So you can see it has a pretty a wide range across the city. And then all these little dots are are actual subjects who participated in the study. So a lot of people. So this was a large, prospectively acute, community-based sample. Again, it was representative and it was population representative, and it was critically not enriched at all for substance use or psychopathology. So some of these kids were just having well visits, and they were asked to come in and participate in research. So we have a nice database of healthy functioning. We have the sample sizes that were available to me and to other researchers have been astounding. And there was lots of variability in cannabis use, which I was really interested in when I came in. So this just quickly shows you kind of what is involved in an effort like this. So the original recruitment pool was 50,000. So they went through all the medical records and they found that 20,000 screened eligible. And then a lot they couldn't get in contact with. They invited some declined, some were excluded for various reasons. Again, we had very few exclusion criteria. So we tried to make this as representative as possible. We basically said, if you can't come in and do our testing, then we can't see you, or if you've had really significant developmental delays, then we won't have you participate. But it has medical disorders as well as psychiatric disorders. And so in the substance use sample, we ended up with around, that's excluded, with around just under 5,000 individuals between the ages of 14 and 21. And the reason our sample size got cut about half is because basically no kids between 8 and 13 were using substances. Very few were using substances, so we decided to make a age 14 cutoff. And as I said, this was the effort. So primary recruitment was between 2009 and 2011. This was kind of the tail end of it. This is how many people were seen each month. And so in some months, up to 300 people were being seen in that month. And so this was a pretty substantial effort. Most of it was, about 2/3 was in the individual's home. They would interview the child, they would interview the parent if they were under 18 as well. They would do structured psychiatric interviews, substance use interviews, a brief battery of cognitive tests, and then again, 1,500 of them were selected for neuroimaging as well. And all of this data pretty much is public. So if anyone is a qualified researcher and wants to go and analyze some of it, it's actually available to download on the NIH website. So there is, so the cognitive battery we gave is called the PIN computerized neurocognitive battery. The reason that this is important is because it was only an hour long. Most cognitive batteries we give when someone comes into a clinic and they're worried about something like Alzheimer's disease, they're multiple hours. And so there needed to be a battery that was quick, that we could give to 10,000 kids, that we could take into their home, and that would be really reproducible. And so Ruben Gur and colleagues have created this battery, and we've worked to refine it a bunch over the past few years as well. So it gives 14 tests measuring accuracy and speed in 5 cognitive domains. There's lots of studies to support its validity. And then this is what some of the stimuli look like. So there's word memory, face memory, your ability to kind of pay attention, how much you can kind of keep track of things in your short-term memory. I won't go into too much detail about that for the sake of time. And then we had 3 cannabis use groups. So we had occasional users, reported use once per week or less over the past year, frequent users who reported daily use 3 to 4 times per week over the past year, and then we had non-users who never used cannabis. And so we had a chance to look with large data at some of the questions that have been out there, and also to control for a lot of things, to really be able to include a lot of things in our statistical models, and also have a representative sample that wasn't drawn from substance use facilities. And I show this again, you don't have to pay attention to a lot of this, but when I show you the results, you'll see why this is important. Groups were very mismatched on a lot of these things, and usually that's something that you want to avoid. You want to have kind of your groups to be as similar as possible in all the characteristics except the one you're interested in studying. But here we had substantial group differences in alcohol use. We had differences, and there's much more men, again, men using more substances. And we had higher rates of mental health problems in our occasional users and in our frequent users of cannabis. All right, and so what did we find? So here, the green are the non-users, the blue are the occasional users, and the red are the frequent users. And here are 4 different cognitive domains: executive control or executive functioning, memory, complex cognition, which is most kind of similar to IQ, and then social cognition, or your ability to kind of pick up social cues from other individuals. And as you can see, again, Dr. Wolk talked a little bit about confidence intervals. Again, the more that they overlap, the more that there's not any differences. And basically what we showed is that there was no differences in cognitive functioning between frequent users between the ages of 14 and 21 and non-users. And in fact, surprisingly, our occasional user group, so the people who used once a week or less, actually performed slightly better in memory and social cognition. And so I spent a year on these data by themselves to make sure that they were correct. I had other people analyze it. I made sure that there wasn't something really wonky with reverse coding. I was like, are we sure non-users are actually non-users? We went and looked at all of these things to see whether they over-reported whether individuals who reported substance use over-reported other symptoms, to see maybe they're just lying to us, because it is a self-report measure. But they basically, when I showed you that, the table of what they look like, the important thing about that is they look like cannabis users in other studies. So they have the characteristics of cannabis users. So this was shocking. It took a while to get it published because despite the fact that we had the largest sample ever conducted, people were still pushing back on this and saying, well, it's hard to get null results published. Null meaning like you say there's no difference between groups, as opposed to statistically significant findings where you go, aha, here's this difference, and now I'm going to talk a lot about it. We had to say, well, there's not this difference, and maybe a lot of the other research that's out there is wrong, and we're right. So then the only other thing that we did that we thought was somewhat interesting was we looked at what are called age-by-group interactions. So that's kind of this idea, does this effect of cannabis potentially differ by age groups? So is there more of an effect in the adolescent users? And we showed that there was a slightly larger effect in terms of executive function. Again, I say larger, but it's still not a large effect. It's still, if you look at it overall, it's an effect size of about 0.2, which is considered to be quite small. But there is a slightly larger effect in the adolescent cannabis users in executive function, kind of that higher order thinking. So then we did a couple things. We were like, all right, well, 500 of these individuals were brought back for follow-up testing. Now we have follow-up testing at up to 4 or 5 time points. We've really only looked at 2 time points right now. We said maybe they didn't show anything when we grabbed them at one point in time. Maybe if we look over time, we'll see something. So then we looked at, we separated things out to two different ways. As you can see, once we get to this smaller sample, our cell size, as the number of people we have in each of these conditions, starts to get pretty small. So we looked at this kind of visually, and I'll show that in a second. And then we also divide them in another way where we just looked at the final, how did they end up? Did they end up as a non-user? Did they end up as an occasional user? Did they end up as a frequent user? Taking this first one out of the equation. So thinking that, all right, if someone increased use or someone sustained use, either of those is still really important when we think about cognitive functioning, especially when we follow them up longitudinally. So this was an average 2-year follow-up. It ranged between 1 and about 3.5 years. And what do we show here? Basically, everyone gets a little bit better because they get older, and because the more you take these tests, you get better at them, even a year apart, not much. But really, it has to do with everyone gets better because they are getting older and you get better. So no real differences here. This is something we're trying to publish now. And when you look at it in terms of the change in cognitive functioning by where they ended up, did they end up as a non-user, occasional user, or frequent user? You see main effects, but again, there's those occasional users who are performing better even over time. And then we look at a interaction, group by time interaction in complex reasoning and social cognition, but it was the frequent users who actually got better compared to the other 2 groups. So again, I spent a lot of time with these data, making sure we did everything correct, got other people to analyze it as well. But those were our findings, and the data are what the data are. So adolescent frequent cannabis users showed little evidence of decline in cognitive performance over a mean 2-year follow-up, and occasional users, we also did some looking at late versus early users. Late users did perform slightly better than early users in this, but they continued to perform better in memory, complex cognition, and social cognition. All right, so then we started talking about possibilities. Okay, why were we seeing these effects? So there's 3 possibilities that we came up with. The first is our sample may be less severe. Maybe what we're not getting are we had almost in that frequent user group, it was mostly daily users or almost daily users. So we thought that was a pretty severe sample. But maybe it's not as severe as other samples have been looked at. Maybe it just takes longer. Maybe 2 years isn't long enough to follow up. Maybe we need to follow up over something like 20 years to really see those cumulative effects. And I'll talk about some of that research that has been done in a few minutes. And maybe there's just not moderate or large magnitude effects out there. Maybe the studies that have been published are small effects. And so maybe large magnitude effects or even medium magnitude effects, again, thinking about that strength of association, maybe that's not evident at a population level. And then we realized we could actually look at that. We could actually do our own meta-analysis. So despite the fact that there's been 2 meta-analyses done in adult users, no one had done this in adolescent or young adult users. So we decided to focus specifically on this sample of studies. And so we went through painstaking detail to synthesize 67 studies. And so we have about 2,000 cannabis users across all these studies and about 5,700 comparison participants with minimal cannabis exposure. It doesn't mean no exposure, it means minimal, probably hasn't caused them significant harm. So we looked at 376 total effect sizes across the whole cross-sectional literature. What is an effect size? An effect size is when a study reports this group had this mean and the standard deviation, meaning like what was their average performance, and this group had another mean. And then you take those and you subtract them in kind of a slightly fancy way and you get an effect size. So again, it gives you the strength of association. Okay, and what did we find from that? So we found that we are not crazy. The effect is negative 0.25, which is it's called a standardized mean difference, or Cohen's d effect size. That's thought of traditionally as a small effect size. Small effect sizes can be clinically meaningful, although in the context of neuropsychological assessment, this is traditionally thought to be not very meaningful. The largest effect size was in immediate memory. In this executive functioning abstraction, we kind of separated out executive functioning into these different areas because there's been some theories that certain areas are affected more than others. So here's our effect size. This is domains instead of studies. Here is our 0 line again, which means no effect. So you can see that some domains cross 0. There is this mean effect, and then here's the confidence interval for that mean effect. But basically, everything clusters within this range. There's no larger effects out here. And this was interesting because we've done previous meta-analyses. I've done them in methamphetamine use, and those effects are shifted quite a bit over here. So they are quite large. So again, there is precedent for showing medium to large size effects in studies of substance use. And again, getting back to alcohol, when you look at alcohol, the effect sizes are substantially larger. So this is currently under review. So other things we looked at, we said, all right, you can also do analyses where you look at how the effect size varies by study characteristics or by sample characteristics. So with increasing potency of cannabis, you would expect effect sizes to get larger over time. They don't. They basically stay around the same. So there's not much variability. There was this one study in 1989 that showed a pretty huge effect, but then since then things have gotten tighter again. The size of these error bars indicates like the number of effect sizes you have. So these early studies were pretty small, or these early years were pretty small, and as you can see in recent years, there's been a fair amount published on it. All right, how does it vary by age? So the studies where they just look at adolescents here we defined as 18 and under. There's questions about whether that's a valid cutoff, but it's kind of the best we could do. We also looked at age as a variable where we're just looking at the mean age of the sample. But the studies of adolescents are no different from the studies of adults or the studies of mixed adolescent and adult samples. That would be a sample of like 10 to 30-year-olds or something like that. So there's no real difference there. These look different, but again, nothing statistically significant. But certainly not adolescents being bigger. When we looked at, similar to the previous meta-analysis I talked about, when we looked at study abstinence criteria, we showed that there was a significant difference between those studies that required an abstinence period of greater than 72 hours versus an abstinence period of less than 72 hours, or either didn't have an abstinence period or just didn't even mention abstinence. And so this, as you can see, crosses that 0 line. So that means there's no statistically significant effect in these 15 studies that looked at this. So again, this to me was fairly shocking. I should point out these are all cross-sectional studies. We wanted to look at longitudinal studies, so studies over time where they look at people at multiple points in time, but there weren't enough studies and they were really heterogeneous in a lot of characteristics. So some of them followed people up like ours for 2 years and some followed them up for 20 years. And when you start getting into that, it's hard to synthesize those results in any sort of meaningful way. But the interesting thing about this is consistent with the adult literature. So we're not sure what to make of all this yet. It does seem that kind of the residual effects of cannabis might be due to some extent to abstinence. So if people are not guaranteeing abstinence or not even asking people to remain abstinent in a study, then they could have used the day of before they had cognitive testing. They could have used the day before. Or they could have been using every day, then stopped and had some cannabis withdrawal effects, which actually do occur. So other studies have shown a similar effect in the longitudinal data. So little evidence of cognitive deficits with a period of abstinence of a few days to a few weeks, even in adolescents and even with longer-term follow-up periods of about 10 years. So these studies find that in their frequent user groups who continue, there actually are some evidence of, again, small cognitive deficits, but when people stop, when they're abstinent, the effects seem to diminish substantially. And I'll show you one study that's actually has been really prominent that contests some of these findings in just a second. So there's also been 3 recent longitudinal studies that 2 of them have looked at twin samples. Again, those wonderful twin studies where they can look at genetic versus other effects. And basically all found no specific effect of cannabis on decline in cognitive functioning. So better accounted for by genetic factors or, in one case, confounders such as smoking cigarettes, which is, again, surprising. So to kind of present the other side of the debate, so the strongest evidence comes from this longitudinal cohort from New Zealand. So it's the Dunedin, if I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, longitudinal cohort from New Zealand, and they followed 1,037 individuals basically from birth to age 38. They started assessing cognitive functioning and substance use around age 8. And they showed that adolescent onset cannabis users who continued, again, adolescent onset, who continued using almost daily through early adulthood showed declines in IQ and worse performance in these domains by their late 30s. So it's a very selective group, and I'll show you that here. So basically, this is it's kind of a busy figure, but this is a change in full-scale IQ and standard deviation units. And one diagnosis means at one follow-up period, there's up to, I think, 4 follow-up periods, but if they had one diagnosis of either a cannabis use disorder or frequent cannabis use across follow-up periods, there's basically no effect. And there's no difference between whether somebody started before age 18, I think, and after age 18. If they had 2 diagnoses, it looks like there's an effect, but it's not statistically significant, and there's not really much of an effect there. With 3 diagnoses, once you sustain that use across multiple years, there does seem to be an effect. But again, you've gone from 1,000 people down to 22 or 23 people here. So it's a very selective group that we might see this effect, and it's a very specific conditions, but it's still something to be concerned about. Again, with sustained use and with adolescent starts. But a lot of people like to argue about this. This study got a lot of popular press because it was actually really, really well done. They tried to account for a lot of different confounders. They dealt with alternative explanations to this. So it was a well-done study, but then there's still people who say you can't put this into a causal framework because it's still observational to some degree, and you don't know how those individuals were before in terms of a lot of characteristics. All right, so what are some of the conclusions? So active, frequent cannabis use is likely associated with small magnitude effects in cognitive function. So that's been shown by our longitudinal data, our cross-sectional data, and meta-analytic studies. Effects may substantially diminish with abstinence. And again, there's many confounds. There's many ways that these groups are different. However, adolescent onset, long-term, sustained heavy cannabis use, so greater than 10 years, that's kind of the points where we have data are about 10 years, and then we have this other data from 20 years, may be sufficient to contribute to cognitive decline. And a really big active area of future research, and one that the National Institute of Health and the National Institute of Drug Abuse are really interested in, are this idea of what increases or decreases risk for cognitive and brain dysfunction. So they funded this study called the ABCD study, which I think I talked about in a second, to basically look at 10,000 kids starting at age 9 or 10, follow them longitudinally, and see what happens once they initiate cannabis use, what predicts initiation of cannabis and other substance use, and then what happens once individuals initiate use. So they're following people about every 2 years. So that will provide a lot of information about these things. Okay. So moving on to structural brain measures. I'm going to move relatively quickly through this since this is the last one. So some people have argued that, okay, maybe these tests of cognitive functioning that you give, they're all well and good, but maybe they're not sensitive enough to detect these declines that are occurring. And when a study comes out showing differences in brain measurements from MRIs between cannabis users and healthy individuals, it gets a lot of press. So this was a study in 2014 done with 20 cannabis users and 20 non-users. And they actually had pretty good measures of how frequently people use, and they looked at that. And they showed these changes here. This is kind of a section of the brain right through here. These changes in kind of these deep structures of the brain that are associated with emotional functioning and associated with addiction. Okay. And it was a cross-sectional study. The authors were actually really good about not putting it within a causal framework, and they actually do great work. So they just pointed out these associations, and then the popular press decided to put it within a causal framework. So all of these things, call it casual pot use causes brain abnormalities in the young study. Marijuana reshapes the brains of users, study claims. Recreational pot use harmful to young people's brains. So, and to their credit, the authors very much pushed back against this when they were interviewed about it, saying that like, this is not what we said at all. We just showed these associations which we thought were just interesting and worthy of further study. So this caused a researcher, a group, to go back and look at some of the data they had, and they conducted a study of daily marijuana users, so not even kind of the more casual marijuana use the previous study had. They had 50 adolescents in each group and then 29 adults in each of these groups, so comparing daily marijuana use to non-users. And as part of the study, they didn't do a formal meta-analysis, but they did create one of these forest plots to look at the size of effect. So here again is that central line, and what do you see? So this is their data. It all kind of clusters around here, and it goes every which way. This is which I can't actually see it. There's the Gilman study is somewhere, I think, here, and it basically shows that this data goes on this side, so showing that marijuana users have greater volumes than controls, and this one goes on the other side, showing that there's differences all over the place, and there's not really much of reproducibility in these effects. So then they got an even larger data set where they looked at 439 adolescents, including 201 regular cannabis users, 853 adults, including 191 regular cannabis users. And they looked at, again, differences in the volume of structures in the brain. And they showed really strong associations with alcohol use. Blue showed significant association with alcohol use, but none with cannabis use. Again, kind of shocking. They also looked at white matter structure and showed similar pattern results, strong effects with alcohol, not much effects with cannabis use. We decided to look at our data as well. So we had 747 cannabis non-users, 59 occasional users, and 27 frequent users. Again, the sample size goes down a lot when you just look at the subsample who had neuroimaging. And we showed no differences in volume or gray matter density. Gray matter density meaning the amount of gray matter within a certain structure, the amount of neurons within a certain structure, of brain regions by cannabis use status. So we're writing this up right now as well. All right, so some overall conclusions. So there's a limited evidence of a statistical association between cannabis use and structural brain changes. And there's limited evidence of a statistical association between sustained abstinence from cannabis use and impairments in cognitive functioning. And again, these are not just my conclusions, they're also the conclusion of the National Academy of Sciences report. So I felt a little bit more relieved to have that kind of out there to make sure, again, that we weren't crazy. There's some stronger evidence of an association between frequent or early cannabis use and psychosis and schizophrenia, and then again, frequent or early cannabis use and later cannabis use problems. So this is not to say that cannabis is not a risky substance. It's still a psychoactive substance. It's just we wanted to identify what are the risks and how specific are they, what is their magnitude. And so even though the causal framework is not firmly established, it's still a risky psychoactive substance, especially for individuals with a heightened risk of psychosis, schizophrenia, or cannabis use problems or other substance use problems in the past in their family. And it still might be risky for adolescents, especially because of the psychosis risk and other kind of poor reactions and just poor decision making in general. So one thing is to encourage the delay of cannabis use in adolescents, as has been done, as talked about by Dr. Wolk. So what are some of the future things that are going to be looked at? So cannabidiol, didn't go forward. Cannabidiol is one of the other cannabinoids in cannabis, and it's been proposed that cannabidiol and THC have these opposing effects. So THC actually, makes some people have paranoid experiences. CBD seems to actually have antipsychotic properties. But the problem is most of the substance that's available out there is high in THC because that's the part that is psychoactive, and not as high in CBD. But if you can potentially adjust that, people have proposed that might be a harm reduction way of dealing with some of these concerns, especially with the psychosis concern. The big problem is trying to get people to use high CBD cannabis and low THC cannabis. not many people have shown, that that can be an effective intervention. So there have been studies where they've looked at this and they've actually brought people to the lab and given them CBD or THC or those in combination and shown that CBD does tend to kind of bring down both the cognitive and some of the psychosis-inducing effects of THC. So I think it's a really fruitful avenue to look at in the future if we can do the research, which is always a challenge with this. And then the next question is there a cannabis by vulnerability interaction? So really, for whom is cannabis a bigger risk, a more serious risk? So are there differences in brain vulnerability to individuals who will have problems with cannabis versus not? And we still don't know a lot about that. Longitudinal research will be critical to understand this better. And then how a family history of psychosis affects things, and then also this kind of gets at the idea of genetics and how genetics might affect the association between cannabis use and these negative behavioral outcomes. So I mentioned the ABCD study. The first wave of data for this just came out. Unfortunately, it's 9 and 10-year-olds, and so they're not using yet, so we don't have much data on cannabis yet, but this is also all going to be public. I mean, we're moving into an era that's pretty incredible in terms of the research that's being funded. Larger studies are being funded more and more, and they're more often available to the public and to scientists to actually look at, and to, people are not hiding their data anymore in kind of a drawer somewhere so that no one has access to it. And these large studies are needed to really look at these things, because most of the studies we've had to date have been small. They're not representative of people. If I choose 20 people from Philadelphia and you try to translate that to California, there might be substantial differences in lots of socio-demographic characteristics and other characteristics as well. So we need larger studies. All right, the last thing is just some acknowledgments. People with whom I work, the heads of my lab, Ruben and Raquel Gore, and then some of my co-authors on these manuscripts, the participants who took part in the PNC and continue to take part in that, and a lot of the data team involved in amassing this large quantity of data, and then funding sources for some of this research. And that's it. Thank you.
How many of you were surprised by something you saw in this presentation? Okay, that truly is everybody this time. Is there a gateway effect to marijuana use?
Always a great question. Very tough to answer. I think some of the data that I presented on risk for other substance use disorders and alcohol use disorders kind of speaks to that. The gateway hypothesis is a tough one, because in that way, tobacco is also a gateway drug. Alcohol is also a gateway drug. It's not really clear whether there's something special about cannabis besides a kind of a propensity to take risks and potentially do something that might, influence your brain and your cognitive functioning, and have some sort of propensity for those sorts of decisions. So it's a really tough question. It's another way you can look at it is there's a substantial number of cannabis users who never use other substances, and there's more cannabis users who never use other substances than there are cannabis users who use other substances. So it's a tough one. Again, as my graduate school mentor said, science is hard, and I think that's probably the best advice I've ever gotten.
Okay, substance abuse treatment programs test using urine samples, often prompting clients to change from use of THC products to alcohol due to short-term metabolites being less able to track in a sample. Should we change what we focus on in collecting our urine samples?
That's a great question, and it's one I don't have a good answer for, unfortunately. I don't do a lot of treatment research, but I would say they both have a risk of use, and especially with people with problematic cannabis use, it's still a risk of continued use, because obviously the person is there because they're having problems with the substance. I do think that reducing the use of alcohol in those sorts of settings would be extremely useful, and it should probably be a similar sort of criteria. If we're going to do it for cannabis, we probably should do it for alcohol as well.
The use and availability of CBD oil is skyrocketing, with the reputation as a safe cure-all. What is the best resource for safety of use in breastfeeding, lactation, and pregnancy?
I'd actually have no answer to that question, unfortunately. I don't know of a good resource to look up safety because I don't know who's doing that work outside of Colorado. It really is the Wild West in terms of products. And I know there's going to be a lot of companies kind of competing to be the one that develops products that are more pharmaceutical grade than anything else. So I think that will be coming, but right now I haven't seen anything, and I'm certainly not looking for information about the safety of CBD oil for anyone that I'm treating or anything like that.
What is the probability of a blood test that would show individuals at risk, like genetics, DNA, for a negative outcome with cannabis use, i.e. psychosis, paranoia, lack of motivation, rather like a risk of cancer test? Is there some way we can detect things?
It's a great question. So there is a lot of work in this area about risk for psychosis, and I think that's kind of the avenue that is going to be most successful in the near future. So there's this thing called a polygenic risk score for schizophrenia, which combines a bunch of different genetic markers to look at whether one's risk might be heightened. It's still kind of in the early stages. It's been pretty well established now, but something like that could be done in the near future, I think. I don't think we're too far away from that. And the relevance of that as well is that there have been some research that's shown that individuals with a higher polygenic risk score for schizophrenia are more likely to use cannabis as well. And so there is some of that shared risk, and that it also affects differences in brain structure that have been found in cannabis users. So such that individuals who use cannabis who are at high risk according to this risk score actually have more evidence. Again, it's small studies because you're getting down into small numbers of people there, have a higher risk of brain volume differences in studies.
Can you define what cannabis misuse disorder looks like? Withdrawal symptoms, things like that?
It is similar to other substance use disorders in that you're really looking for dysfunction in someone's life due to the substance. So they spend a lot of time using it, they give up important responsibilities because of it, and there can be some withdrawal symptoms, although they are much more psychological than physical. So irritability if they stop using, so some mental fogginess as we kind of went through during abstinence, some depression and anxiety, that sort of thing that does occur with an abstinence period. So with those withdrawal symptoms tend to only show up in kind of the more frequent users.
How do the magnitude effects in cognitive functioning for cannabis use compare with alcohol?
So again, a great question. So the alcohol research, I don't know if there's been a meta-analysis specifically done in adolescents. What I do know is in adults, when you look at the effect sizes are double or triple with alcohol compared to cannabis use. Alcohol also has a similar profile that if you stop, you will actually see some recovery of cognitive functioning, although it's not entirely complete. If you use for 20 years every day or something like that, you really have to stop for a couple of years to see that recovery of cognitive functioning as well. But I think that there's still a lot of research to be done with adolescents and alcohol use as well.
So we focused a lot on adolescents. What about long-term use and development? What is the impact on older adults who have used cannabis throughout their life? And are there studies focusing on this group?
There definitely are. So some of the early studies of cannabis use and cognitive functioning focused on the more chronic users, the people who have been using for 20, 30 years. And so that was the really messy figure meta-analysis I showed you. And in those studies, they show very similar effects, which again is shocking given some of the effects from the Dunedin longitudinal cohort. But again, it might be that when you capture individual cannabis users, you're capturing a wide spectrum of cannabis users. How long they've been using, what strength they've been using. Some of them use once a day, some of them use multiple times a day, some of them use a couple times a week. So there's significant variability in that, and again, there's significant variability in risk for cognitive deficits and brain dysfunction secondary to cannabis use.
So you spoke a bit about increased potency. So is there research suggesting that increased potency is associated with increased smoking? Or if cannabis is more potent, does research suggest that people will smoke less as it is more effective?
I'm trying to think of what I've seen around that, and there's not that many studies that I've seen to date. The only things I've seen are that when you try to get individuals who smoke high THC cannabis to use a lower THC type of cannabis, they're less willing to do so. It's hard to get someone to switch to a type of THC that doesn't make them feel high if they've gotten some benefit out of the substance before. So that's really what I've seen, and that's mostly based on these studies in London where they look at the individual smoking skunk and try to get them to switch to a lower THC cannabis and try to do this public health approach to kind of decrease psychiatric admissions later, because these are individuals at high risk of psychosis, and it's very hard to get them to not use high THC cannabis.
So this is asking you to clarify the twin association. So the second twin who did not use cannabis before age 17, are they at higher risk, lower risk than at older age for addictions or psychosis?
Yeah, so there's a pretty substantial body of research on this around schizophrenia and psychosis, showing that family members and especially twins, even if they don't have schizophrenia or psychosis, that they actually have some behavioral markers that look kind of like they have some symptoms of psychosis. So there is a strong genetic component to that. There seems to be a strong genetic component to substance use as well, again, which really comes out later in life with patterns of substance use. But there is a strong genetic component in both. So are they at increased risk? Yes, but there seems to be something slightly different about them, and I don't think we know a lot about what that might be.
So I know you're a cognitive researcher, but I just thought we'd throw this one in for kicks. What do studies show in use in relation to testosterone levels, like sperm count or two-headed sperm? There's no name on it, Steve. I don't know.
All right. Now
I don't think I can comment on that. I don't think I've seen any research on that. At least it hasn't really, if it comes across my desk, I haven't really paid that much attention to it, and perhaps I should. Okay.